All right, so what is the big question? Well, we can introduce it this way. Take a moment in your mind and picture a primitive human. Try to conjure up an actual visual image in your mind of an the earliest even, human. And what do you see? What does it look like for you? I would have questions for you if we sat down the round table and talked about it, like how hairy is this person? What's the facial shape of the person? How long are his arms? Are the knuckles dragging the ground? And these are some popular images of what's the classic term for this. You may even be thinking it. What is the classic term for this guy? Does anyone have a word or a phrase that's popping to your mind? Caveman. The caveman, yeah. We seem to know a lot as a society about the caveman. And if you look at the actual evidence or lack of evidence of the caveman, you'd be really impressed about how much we know about this this person. We don't know whether or not he existed, but we know everything about him, as peculiar as that is. So, by way of introduction, this Dr. Larry Azar wrote a preface to a book that has helped me tremendously, and it's a book that's inspired a good bit of what we're going to look at tonight. And Larry Azar said this in his preface to G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, and I'm quoting, "Today, the American Civil Liberties Union, in defending evolution, will not even permit the use of the word kind, K-I-N-D, will not permit the use of the word kind, for it insists, the ACLU insists, that there is no difference in kind between man and other animals. And the winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, Albert Szent-Györgyi, categorically maintained in his book, The Cell and the Protoplasm, quote, there is no real difference between cabbages and kings." In G.K. Chesterton's book, which I'm going to kind of give you somewhat of an overview of tonight, mixed in with some Wes Young as well, and some scripture, Chesterton shows that all of these stances, that man and animal are the same thing, just of a different variety. And even kings and cabbages are all stemming from the same thing. There's really no substantial difference in kind. Chesterton says, all of that comes not from evidence, but from a prejudgment. Because if the facts are honestly investigated, it will show, as Chesterton puts it, that man is not an evolution, but a revolution. All right, so here's this first bit of evidence for that argument, that there's something different about you and me from a cabbage or from even the cleverest of animals, golden retrievers included. Chesterton writes, quote, "The archaeologist dug very deep, and he found a place where a man had drawn a picture of a reindeer," which is true. But this archaeologist would have to dig a good deal deeper before he found a place where a reindeer had drawn a picture of a man. Isn't that something? "It is the simple truth," he goes on to say, that man does differ from the brutes in kind. Not in degree, but in kind. And the proof of it is here, that it sounds like an obvious truth to say that the most primitive man drew a picture of a monkey. But it sounds like a joke to say that the most intelligent monkey drew a picture of a man. Art, he says, art is the signature of man. Every sane sort of history must begin with man, as something standing absolute and alone. And he's got a lot of examples of that. The man drawing a picture of a monkey, well, yeah, sure, anyone could do that. Nikki could do that, Mariah could do that. But show me a monkey that would draw a picture of a man, and it sounds like a joke, because that's not going to happen. And he said of ants, like fire ants, he said, they're used even in the book of Proverbs as an example of industriousness. But where is the ant hill where they have hallways of ant statues dedicated to the memory of famous ants that passed before them. You know, as we have busts and statues of George Washington and so forth, where's that in the anthills? You know, and it just sounds like a joke to say it. To say that man and animals are very close, you know, just because we might have appendages or something, is to really ignore the bulk of the evidence that there is something drastically, capital D, drastically different between us and all the other creatures that walk the earth. And so, if y'all will go to that first slide, please, which I know is kind of small print, but you're familiar with it, and if you'd like to use a Pew Bible or your Bible, it's Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 24, kind of our anchor verse for tonight. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds." Take that, American Civil Liberties Union. "The livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And I'm going to tell you something. When you read Genesis chapter 1 with evolution on the brain, you will be surprised, possibly, as if for the first time, by how often that phrase is repeated. That seemingly not significant phrase that would have been good enough to just say it once. It's in there over and over and over, each according to its kind. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." And he's speaking our as in God, or gods of the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is the way I understand the plural there. You notice he didn't say any of that in verse 24 or 25. You know, he didn't say, "Let us make the kangaroo in our image," or whatever. But he says it here, "Let us make mankind, humans, in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And I intend tonight, as much as I often, I'll say always, avoid this subject, I truly do, I want to face head up to it tonight, and at least within the parameters of what I can see and what I think, give us some perspective, a sober look at what this storyline is. And I'm not doing it to be controversial, to talk about evolution directly like this. I'm doing it, frankly, because it has rocked my faith. About a month ago, and I shared this with Robin during a pretty low time, about a month ago, it seemed like there was some kind of conspiracy in my reading life. And it was torture. Just every book I read, one book after another, I felt like the authors were conspiring against me to just, and they weren't related authors. I mean, they were people probably never even met one another, may have been written in different centuries. But one book after another took as an obvious truth that mankind just sort of evolved its way up and invented the idea of gods along the way. And I felt like I was really shaken in a foundational place there. And I want to give us some answers to that and some thoughts. Now, a quick point right off is there's a difference between evolution, the idea that things change over time. Any dog breeder knows that an animal can be changed over time. And that can be manipulated. It's like any gardener can know the genetic changes of things over time. We recognize that. I guess maybe what shakes us to the core is what we might call evolutionism, which is sort of more of a worldview. It's actually a religious statement more than a scientific one. Another thing, to sort of some rubble to get out of the road right off the bat, is let's try not to mistake the evolution of technology, the evolution of technological stuff that humans make, our gadgets, with the actual evolution of humans. I understand that Adam and Eve did not have iPhones. Okay. That's no fault of theirs. Cain and Abel did not have John Deere tractors. But you know what? Neither would you and me if we were dumped on some deserted island with nothing. The iPhones and the John Deere tractors and the levers and the pulleys and the gadgets and the gizmos take time to build and create and improve upon. There is an evolution of technology. The iPhone 6 is not as good as the iPhone 12. But to say that the people holding it have evolved significantly just because Adam didn't have it is a real misconstruction of the evidence that we have. If a person 5,000 years ago used a wheelbarrow, and I use a Pioneer side-by-side, that's no credit to me, and it's no discredit to him. The wheelbarrow was just what he had back then. And the Pioneer side-by-side, through no credit of my own, I didn't invent the thing. I don't even know how it works. But if I have one, I'm just riding on the backs of people that figured things out before me. I say that it felt like a conspiracy, and I think I'll give you some examples of that. Your nation has completely adopted this as far as its vocal public stance on things. Robert and I visited the Smithsonian several years ago, and I was taken aback by how taken for granted the whole thing was, that everything evolved from simpler life forms. And just it's not questioned. There's no alternative view of it. It's just the way that it is to the Smithsonian, like the national museums of our nation's capital. And I even found an issue of the Smithsonian magazine I had stashed away somewhere other in the classroom. So I'll quote it. Now this is a 2013 Smithsonian magazine. So that's ancient history, right? It's 10 years old. I doubt much has changed. So here's what it says. About 100,000 years ago, modern human beings started spreading out from their initial homeland in Africa to occupy Europe, Asia, and by sea, even Australia, displacing or absorbing Neanderthals and other archaic hominid species. That diaspora took about 70,000 years, and when it was completed, our ancestors stood triumphant. Skip. Elsewhere in that same Smithsonian magazine, it said, and this one is a little more near and dear to my heart perhaps because it deals with language, which is the art of language is the way I spend my days at school and in my job and so forth. Quote, the primate that for a time rose to dominate the planet communicated with its peers using a code of grunts exhaled from the orifice of ingestion, that is your mouth, or its mouth, and shaped by lips and inner membranes, muscles, and teeth. Anyway, the argument being that something like a sophisticated monkey, when it went by the rock, and then another monkey, sort of a similar, when it went by the same rock, and eventually they began to understand that gray, hard thing there that we crack our coconuts on is a And over time, they came up with other grunts for coconut and crack and so forth. In keeping with Chesterton's spirit in this, we have to ask, how could you possibly know what the earliest of humans said? Did we expect them to not only have vocal cords, but also a convenient tape recorder nearby? Chesterton makes a joke. He says, the popular science says that cavemen must have been naked. Why? Because when we find their bones, we don't find their clothes. And Chesterton's reply is, did we expect his trousers to be made of stone like his hatchet? Of course you don't find his clothes or his tape recorder. He didn't produce podcasts. For all we know, he was as articulate as Shakespeare. But we wouldn't know it until it was written down, which that brings up part of what I think is the foundational error of the whole thing. When man started writing it down, since there's no tape recorder that was presumably not invented at the time, and even if it was, it wouldn't stand the test of time, we don't really have history of man, not history proper, until man started writing. And when we have that, what do we have? We have the writings of mankind as men. The earliest writings of the men is the cuneiform, the pointy Babylonian type shapes, really strange looking letters to our Western eyes. But it's a language with syllables and words. And what does it describe? It describes get this, civilization. The curtain, as he says, the curtain rises on a mankind that is already a mankind. And you need look no further than the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. Three ancientest of people that are, by the way, mentioned at length in the Bible, to see that they were very much men doing civilized things. I know they didn't have iPhones, but their civilizations were no less complex or even democratic than ours. That's fascinating. How this leap from what is known about history, the cuneiform tablets from 3200, I think, BC, to this grand assumption that they must have been something primate-like before that. The key there is assumption. To speak of the history of prehistory. Now think about that phrase. It'll hit you in a minute. We're going to talk about the history of prehistory. That's like me saying, I'm going to now draw you a diagram. We're going to discuss the substance of nothing. How could you? How could you? Or like Simon and Garfunkel, listen to the sound of silence. It's hard to listen to. Nikki asked me the other day, this week, she said, I don't know where they hear these things at school. Daddy, is there an Area 31? And I said, no. And it's Area 51. You see, that's an obvious illogic. I mean, you can't talk about what's not. The history of prehistory, Chesterton's example is he says, we might as well talk about the pre-diluvian flood, which I love that. The flood, the flood before floods and so forth. The modern storyline, I'm going to, after reading and feeling conspired against, and I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on what people think, okay? This seems to me to be the modern storyline worldview of our day. There once was something very simple, a basic something. We'll call it a single-celled organism. But even the cell was not really a cell because this thing, this original something, was so basic. And then the cell, or simpler version of a cell, had a genetic accident. Now that's a key plot point of this story. The genetic accident. Random mutation, some accident. And it allowed this something, which reproduced into another something, to be more fit for survival than the original something. And as the accidents happened, the fittest survived. And so the somethings became more and more fit to survive, and they reproduced other somethings which became more and more complex, which allowed them more fitness to survive, and only the fittest survive. This went on for a very, very long time. And the complexity of the things went beyond any proportions that you could ever have imagined from looking at the original something, whatever that was. In fact, the things that are now living things got so complex that they began, as an aid to their survival, to invent gods for themselves, to invent complex religions, to invent complicated ideas of a creator. And because, for whatever reason, that idea helped them survive, maybe because of, if you believe in a God, you're more likely to self-sacrifice for the good of the group. Maybe there was a sense of community or unity that was aided by this idea of a God. And so the God gene, the tribes that had a God idea tended to fare better than the ones that didn't, and so they reproduced until it became mostly just God-type people that believed in a deity tended to survive better and the others disappeared. The story usually stops there, having fully convinced us that our whole religion is a delusion that just somewhere along the way helped us survive. I would also add one extra step. The complexity of these creatures became so complex that they eventually developed brains that could think about evolution. In other words, not only did the complexity grow till we had religious people, it also grew to a complex form where it had evolutionists who could think about themselves. The next slide is the pictured version, and I know that's small, but we're up there at the top. So you at least get some credit. You made it to the top, but it's all one. 2 points, and I'm going to try to show you some issues with this. It's nothing new. It's nothing you hadn't heard before. But maybe tonight you'll hear the rest of the story. Or we can call to the carpet some of the holes in the story. But the first point is, it's okay not to know everything. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to you that I have gone out to these dig sites and held these bones in my hand and seen the samples. And, I'm not a paleontologist. I'm not even a historian. And that's okay. We don't have to know everything. If it's any comfort to you, the modern masses of men that read things like the Smithsonian magazines aren't historians or archaeologists or paleontologists either. It's only a very select group of people looking at these bones, and perhaps they have their own axes to grind just like the caveman did. But even if I don't know everything, or we don't know from human standpoint hardly anything, the truth is still valuable. And the truth is what I want to live my life by. And it's what I want to pass on to my children. So the truth matters to me. But I am happy to accept the beauty of mystery. People accuse the church of taking, you just don't have any of the mystery. The mystics have all the mystery with their bizarre ceremonies and full moon dances, and they don't even know what they're worshiping. Remember when Paul was in Greece or Corinth or wherever it was, and it said a statue to an unknown God? They love that kind of stuff, the unknown. And the church gets accused of you snatch away all the magic and the mystery and the music of religion. That hadn't been my experience. Much of it is still a beautiful mystery to me. I can read Genesis 1 100 times, probably have. And I don't know how God did it. Are you joking? Have you read that chapter? It very much has the sound of a dance, of a myth in the best sort of myth. Not in a myth as in fiction, but as in a mystery. It is not, like we do in business meeting, now the reading of the last meeting's minutes, the minutes of the last meeting. It is not the minutes of the 6 days or whatever of creation. It's not detailed in that way. It's poetry. So I'm all right with the mystery. The next slide shows you what I'm not all right with. And this is why I think the value of truth, or the devaluing of truth, has had its sad effect on our land. Romans chapter 1. Although they claim to be wise, he's talking about people who have the creation to look at. The creation, Romans 1 is the creation speaks of a creator. Now the evolutionists will jump right in there and say, no, you just think it does, because it's had so many billions of years to complicate itself. It's so complicated you're sort of arbitrarily impressed by it. Richard Dawkins likes to make a big point here about the eyeball. All you Christians are so impressed by the eyeball, he says, but it's just a greater development of a light-sensing organism's light-sensing particle, Sorry, dude, I am impressed by the eyeball. I'm impressed by the people I'm looking at, right? They look great. Anyway, the creation, and that includes you and me, speaks of a creator. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. We won't go back to the previous slide, but it looks a lot more idolatrous than it did before. We are so obsessed, as our modern culture, we are so obsessed with the birds and the animals and the reptiles as our father. As if the birds and the animals and the reptiles got together and said, let us make man in our image. And out rolled human beings. Well, they were doing this in Rome 2,000 years ago, just in a different way. But therefore God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God. Truths about God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They exchanged that for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. That seems to me, by the way, the one character who is not allowed on Richard Dawkins' stage is a creator. Anything created gets to stay and play. Any whisper of a creator is out before the trial even begins. That we settled that out of court, apparently. But that's a prejudgment. The Creator who's forever praised. So I'm not a paleontologist or an archaeologist. I'll tell you what I am, though. I'm a storyteller. And so I want to face up to evolution, the evolutionism story, as a storyteller on the grounds of its own narrative assumptions and its own narrative leaps, what we call in the biz, what we call plot points. And I've got quite a list here, and I fully intend to hit a few tonight, run out of breath and out of time, and finish this list on the Sunday evening service that I preach again. Not this Sunday, but Sunday week. Now, y'all know this is an evening service deal, right? Y'all get that, right? I'm not coming in the morning service with this kind of hoopla. But I feel like a lot of you that are here tonight, if we don't make it through, we won't make it through. We'll come back for that Sunday evening service in a week, and I'll continue. It's a list of maybe about 10 or 15 things I see in the story that you need to know about, and that pulled me, on a personal note, out of that despairing doubt that really sunk me about a month back. Number one, let's be real. The acceptance of evolutionism as an explanation of where you and me came from is not because of intense scientific research on the part of the populace. That is not it. Nobody's reading, the populace at large is not reading the latest publications coming out of the institutes by these actual archaeologists and these actual paleontologists. We accept it because it's so popular, and it's popular because we accept it. As it said in The Greatest Showman, nothing draws a crowd like a crowd. It's just baked into the atmosphere. I had a college math teacher. This was not Miss Paradis. She was my high school math teacher. Now you think in math, talk about the separation of church and state. You feel like in math we could, if there was ever a subject that could be dealt with without getting theological, it would be math. Literature is a little harder, I suppose. But the first day of class, he told this story. He said there was once a caveman. And in the corner, he had spears. He didn't know what amount of spears he had, but he had a sense that after the big hunt of the woolly mammoth or whatever, he had somehow less spears than he had before. And then when he spent time in the rock quarry shaving the staff and flinting out the flint, now he had more spears, and as he evolved, he began to have a sense of number, and that, college algebra students, is where math came from. Let's get started. And I remember that and he wasn't joking, I remember that as a very good example of the permeation of this. Well, of course that's how it happened. And he just came out and said it, but I think everybody has this vague notion that, that's kind of where things came from. I used to try to explain vocabulary to my middle school students who are never thrilled about studying vocabulary. And I said, y'all, it's just elaborate grunts. And I did this in my early years. I was essentially telling the same story I told you earlier about the with the rock. And I said, they're just elaborate grunts. And I tell you the truth, I deliberately repented of that years ago, a decade ago. I don't tell that story anymore because I don't like the word just, which means merely. To say that they're merely an elaborate grunt bothers me now a great deal. That's what the evolutionists would want you to say, is the word merely. You're just a product of a lot of genetic accidents. How's that for your self-esteem, by the way? You're just a bunch of really lucky accidents. Words, it's a little sidetrack, but words now I see upon reflection and prayer and just reading the Scripture, words themselves are divine. In the beginning was the Word. Stew on that for a while and tell me that it's just an elaborate grunt. I don't think so. Movies are part of the atmospheric permeation. And again, this is all that point that it has nothing to do with careful research. People live under the illusion that they've looked into these things and found the caveman. I think even paleontologists live under the illusion that they've actually found the caveman. I got some pictures later of what some of the things they found. As G.K. Chesterton said, I think a lot of people live under the illusion that they actually read Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. People really, I have read it. It's been years, so I'm at least not under that illusion. But I'll tell you this, he really did claim that we all came from either one or two or maybe three basic things, if I remember right. It really is what you think it is. That was his claim. More on that later. Here's some movies. Jurassic Park, when I was in second grade, came out. Shook the world with CGI. They were really good. It was really a breakthrough CGI computer thing. 1993, and me and everyone my age, and probably more people across the country than listened to the State of the Union that year, heard the archaeologist, the main character, explain how dinosaurs evolved into birds. And we just knew that it had to be right because he had the cool hat, the hat. And he saved the kids from the thing with the T-Rex. So, of course, I'll go back further for you more seasoned fellers. 1964, back when you were in second grade. A Don Knotts movie, and I actually do. I really like the movie. I really like Jurassic Park. The Incredible Mr. Limpet. Which he finds this book on reverse evolution. The point being, and if we went back to that picture of the branching, what did it start with? A fish. A lot of the evolutionism narratives begin with a fish. Bizarrely, that Smithsonian magazine that I read the other day pointed out that whales came from mammals, like something like a cow. It's very confusing. We don't know if we went from water to land and then back to the water or which way went first, but in the amazing Mr. Limpet, that we all came from fish, and he just reverse evolutioned back into a fish. And if you've seen the movie, it's a comedy, but he's like a fish that wears spectacles and he can talk. It's hilarious. But it takes for granted that, well, of course we came from fish. 1954. Let's take a big stride back. Who was in second grade in 1954? Now, I love this movie. So much so that we planned a trip to Silver Springs or to the spring next to it this summer. We ended up not able to go. Got sick or something, but I was going to show this movie to my daughters before we went. They filmed it at Silver Springs in Florida. The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I put the little air mattress in the living room, and we watched this movie. And they were laughing at it. I was scared. I had nightmares. It's pretty good, But, I'd forgotten, and I think I'd seen pieces of it before, but I'd forgotten the beginning of the movie. And the beginning of that movie, like the beginning of a lot of movies, is quite religious. It's this fireball. This is an old black and white movie. And it talks about how in the beginning, and it starts that way and it rolls out with this creature coming out of the ocean and developing into, the creature from the Black Lagoon, of course, which was somewhere between a fish and a human. They struck us a little closer to home in 2014 with a movie called Noah, Russell Crowe. And go YouTube it or whatever. Watch the beginning clip of that movie. And it's Russell Crowe's wonderful actor voice. He's playing Noah, and he's telling his son the story. And it's the story of Genesis. And I think as far as I remember, he gets it pretty much, in the beginning. Now, they abbreviate it for cinematic reasons, but it's pretty much the story of Genesis. But it's the visuals that get you. It shows the wiggly little tadpole becoming a bigger fish, wiggling out on land, growing legs, getting taller, becoming a chimpanzee, and then he swings out, this chimp swings out on a vine and lands, and it's not exactly, they didn't quite commit to it, but the very next thing is the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve are. And so it's not direct, it's certainly implied. That atmospheric permeation that I'm referring to is when something is so ambient, it's so accepted, like someone who's never left America saying, of course everyone drives on the right side of the road, that you're on the wrong side of a debate before you even knew there was a debate, is what I mean. Or even if it's not the wrong side, if I want to catch criticism for that, let's just say you have taken a side on a debate without even knowing you took a side, that you even knew there was a debate in the first place. Of course we drive on the right side of the street. And before I leave this point, I'll tell you a fun little one. Did you know, speaking of those books I was reading, you ever heard of phrenology? I never heard of that. But I was reading two innocent little books, not looking for anything sermon related. I was just reading The Hound of the Baskervilles, because I like Sherlock Holmes, so sue me. It's fun to read. Mysteries and so on. And another one was Heart of Darkness, which is a story that starts in London and ends up down in like Middle Africa during the African colonial days. They're just novels. They're fictional novels. Both those books, written in the 1800s, made big mention, or at least passing mention, of the study of, they were very interested in the shape of people's skulls. And I never really thought of that, but those books came out in the 1800s, and phrenology, the study of skull shape, was all the rage. It's considered, I think, a pseudoscience now, or at least that, of course, skulls have different shapes, but that from the shape of the skull you can determine somebody's personality, moral maturity, and so forth. Well, who else was publishing in the 1800s? Darwin. And the shape of the skull and the shape of the chimp's skull or the chimpanzee's skull and so forth is all related in this idea that I can tell you what you're worth by how far up that chain you made it. And I can tell how far by the shape of your skull. Phrenology, I've never seen that being a problem. You know, you don't see anybody waving signs saying, you know, big skulls matter or anything like that. But it has been replaced by what is its grandchild is skin pigmentation. This idea or ideal that you can know something about somebody by how dark or light the pigment of their skin. To me, it doesn't seem a whole great deal different. But this idea that you can know something about somebody, I think it's rooted very much in this same we came from animals mindset. And I'll close with this one because I promised you some pictures. I'm not an archaeologist or a paleontologist, but I've at least come to grips with I don't necessarily trust these people and how far they are willing to stretch the evidence. So let's take a Georgia example, if we can. The next slide. That was found right here in your state, or the Plant Vogel, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Plant Vogel nuclear power plant in Burke County, Georgia. They were preparing for the site and digging and doing construction, and they found these bones, and they put a halt to it. And the power company even funneled some money to protecting it and letting people dig there. That's a graph of the bones that they found. Pretty impressive, right? I shouldn't have put whale at the top. You wouldn't know what those are, but you just see that they found some bones. And then the next slide is an actual picture. Behold, the bones. Pretty cool. And I mean that literally. I'm pretty fascinated by it. But if you go to Georgia Southern University now, and I'm not picking on Georgia Southern, it just happens to be the people in charge of it. If you go to their museum at Georgia Southern in Statesboro to look at these bones, here's what you'll see. It's mostly plaster. I'm concerned about that. It's a between water, it's an amphibious type thing. That's a big part of the story to them, that cows, something like a cow became something like a whale, and something like a fish became something like a human. And so they need these middle things. I told you I'd revisit Darwin briefly. I'll say that when the thing that impressed me most about The Origin of Species was his honest insistence that the fossil record, like the fossils that we've actually found and recorded, is way, way empty. It's way less than what we need to prove any of this stuff. Now, his prediction was we were going to dig deeper, dig further, and find enough fossils to prove it. And that's where we get the term the missing link. But have you ever thought about what that term says? The what link, right? Missing. And so it's interesting that people talk about the missing link as if they've seen it. You don't see something that's missing. And Darwin, I think, was more honest than maybe since then, that the missing link is missing, and most of that skeleton is missing. Maybe it did look like that, but I'm distrustful. And the next one is a more human example. This is Pithecanthropus. And Chesterton says it really well. It's too small to read, but it's a femur bone, a tooth, and maybe the top of a skull. Archaeologists found in Java a piece of a skull, seeming by its contour to be smaller than the human. Somewhere near it, he found an upright thigh bone, and in the same scattered fashion, some teeth that were not human. If they all form part of one creature, which is doubtful, our conception of the creature would be almost equally doubtful. But the effect on popular science was to produce a complete and even complex figure, finished down to the last details of hair and habits. He was given a name, as if he were a character in ordinary history. People talked of Pithecanthropus as of Pitt or Fox or Napoleon. Popular histories published portraits of him, like the portraits of Charles I or George IV. A detailed drawing was reproduced carefully to show that even the very hairs of his head were numbered. So take one last good look at the femur, the tooth, the skull cap, which were found near each other, possibly related to each other, and then the artist rendering on the next slide. You can meet Pithecanthropus. I see Chesterton's point. We're making some pretty bold leaps based off the evidence. And I'm not giving you an exhaustive look at the evidence. I'm just saying I'm exhausted with the evidence, truly. And to build such grand claims off such fragments and to throw it headlong as a battering ram against the church and its version of events, to me, is a real problem. Now, I'll give you a teaser. That's it. I'll give you a teaser about the next Sunday evening, and then we'll actually address it then. Even if it were all true, let's grant them that for a moment. How does it explain where we came from? People spend so much energy debating what came first, the chicken or the egg, the fully developed creature or the simple organism that would develop, the egg that would develop it, that I don't think we stop often enough to ask, all right, have it your way, have it either way. Where did either of them come from? Because the popular story insists that in the beginning there was something. And whether it popped into a man quickly or whether it rolled into a man over billions of years, fast or slow, says absolutely nothing about what we want to know, the religious question of where did it all come from. Everyone is faced with that question of why is there something instead of nothing. Saying that evolution explains where we came from is like saying that a baby going from diapers to pull-ups explains his birth. Unrelated. And it's a logically disconnected topic. And so that we can dig into later. I hope when it's all said and done that something comforted you a little bit, that you're not wrong to believe the things that we believe and to accept that in the beginning God. So I'll leave it at that. Y'all have any questions or comments? Tomatoes to throw or anything like that? All right, so well, that was fun. And to be continued, not next one, Sunday evening kind of a service. I hope you'll come. There's a lot of good left, and the real comfort of the whole thing at the end, and the real implications of a society that rears its children telling them they're genetic accidents versus a society that rears its children telling them they're in the image of God. That, to me, is the real bombshell.